power. It is the engine of history, the dream of mortals, the ultimate prize in the game of nations. To wear the crown is to sit at the apex of human ambition, to command armies, to build legacies in stone and gold, to have your name whispered with reverence and fear for generations. The Bible, more than any other book, is a chronicle of power. It tells the stories of shepherds who became kings, of empires that rose from the dust and conquered the known world. We remember these men for their greatness, their victories, their divine anointing. But that is only half the story. Because a crown is heavy, and the head that wears it is often haunted. For every story of a glorious rise, there is a hidden tale of a tragic fall. For every king who touched the heavens, there is a man who is broken by the very power he wielded. These are not simple tales of good versus evil. They are complex human tragedies. Stories of insecurity, jealousy, hubris, lust, and compromise that turned golden ages into ash. They are cautionary tales, written in the blood and tears of the most powerful men who ever lived. Today, we are not here to celebrate their glory. We are here to uncover their scars, to count down the top 5 most powerful, yet most tragic kings of the Bible, and to learn the bitter lessons they paid for with their kingdoms, their families, and their very souls.
Number 5. Ahab, the king who sold his soul for a queen. Coming in at number 5 is a king whose tragedy is not one of a dramatic personal implosion, but of a slow, willing surrender of his soul. King Ahab of Israel. By many worldly measures, Ahab was a successful monarch. He reigned for 22 years during a period of prosperity and political strength. He was a skilled diplomat, forging a powerful alliance with the neighboring Phoenician Empire. He was a master builder, constructing an opulent ivory palace that was the envy of the region. He commanded a powerful army and secured his nation's borders. On paper, he was a strong king, but in his heart, he was a hollow man, and the void within him would be filled by the most infamous woman in the Old Testament. His power was undeniable. His tragedy was his weakness. Ahab's most significant political move was his marriage to Jezebel, a Phoenician princess. This was a standard political alliance, but Jezebel was no ordinary queen. She was a fanatical worshiper of the storm god Baal and his consort Asherah. She arrived in Israel not as a diplomat, but as a missionary of a foreign faith, and she found in her husband not a king, but a puppet. Ahab, described as weak-willed and morally adrift, did more than just tolerate his wife's religion, he embraced it. He built a massive temple to Baal in the capital city of Samaria, erected an Asherah pole, and actively promoted Baal worship throughout the nation. Under his rule, Israel plunged into its darkest period of state-sponsored idolatry. He stood by as Jezebel systematically hunted and executed the prophets of the Lord, replacing them with hundreds of her own pagan priests. Ahab's defining tragic flaw was his complete and utter spinelessness in the face of a dominant, malevolent influence. He was the king, but he was not in charge. His crown belonged to Jezebel. The ultimate display of his tragic weakness is found in the story of Naboth's vineyard. Next to Ahab's palace was a beautiful vineyard owned by a common man named Naboth. Ahab wanted it for a vegetable garden and offered to buy it. But Naboth, citing the ancient laws of Israel that forbade the permanent sale of ancestral land, honorably refused. Ahab's reaction was not that of a powerful king. He went home sullen and angry, threw himself on his bed, and refused to eat. He was a pouting child in a king's body. When Jezebel saw her husband's pathetic state, she took control with terrifying efficiency. "Is this how you act as king over Israel?" she mocked. "Get up and eat. I'll get you the vineyard of Naboth." She didn't negotiate. She conspired. Jezebel wrote letters in Ahab's name, sealed them with his royal seal, and sent them to the elders of Naboth's town. The letters commanded them to proclaim a public fast and seat Naboth in a place of honor. Then they were to hire 2 scoundrels to falsely accuse him of cursing both God and the king. It was a perfectly orchestrated sham trial. Naboth was dragged outside the city and stoned to death. When the news reached Jezebel, she went to her husband and said, "Go and take possession of the vineyard you wanted. Naboth is no longer alive, but dead." And Ahab, without a word of protest, got up and went to claim his prize, his new garden fertilized with the blood of an innocent man. But as Ahab stood in his stolen vineyard, he was met by his worst nightmare, the prophet Elijah. And Elijah delivered one of the most chilling curses in the Bible. "This is what the Lord says. In the place where dogs licked up Naboth's blood, dogs will lick up your blood, yes, yours. As for Jezebel, dogs will devour her by the wall of Jezreel. Dogs will eat those belonging to Ahab who die in the city, and the birds of the air will feed on those who die in the country." It was a prophecy of utter annihilation for his entire family line. And years later, it came true with gruesome precision. Ahab was killed in battle, and as his chariot was being washed by a pool, dogs came and licked up his blood, just as the prophet had said. Jezebel was thrown from a window, and her body was so completely consumed by dogs that there was nothing left to bury. King Ahab's life is the tragedy of abdicated responsibility. He had all the external trappings of power, but none of the internal moral strength to wield it justly. He shows us that the greatest threat to a leader is not an external enemy, but an internal vacuum of character. His story is a timeless warning that power without a moral compass is a ship without a rudder, destined to crash upon the rocks, taking everyone on board down with it.
Number 4. Nebuchadnezzar, the emperor who became an animal. Our 4th most tragic king was not a king of Israel, but their conqueror. He was the most powerful man of his time, an emperor of unparalleled ambition and achievement, King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar was a titan of history. He transformed Babylon into the most magnificent city the world had ever seen. He built the legendary Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. His armies were invincible, crushing nations, including the Kingdom of Judah, and carrying its people into exile. He was an absolute monarch, the master of a vast empire. His word was law. His will was reality. His power was absolute. His tragedy was his ego. The book of Daniel gives us an intimate psychological portrait of this emperor. It begins with a dream that terrified him. He dreamt of a colossal statue with a head of gold, a chest of silver, a belly of bronze, legs of iron and feet of mixed iron and clay. Then a stone cut without human hands struck the statue's feet, and the entire edifice crumbled into dust.
Only the Hebrew exile Daniel could interpret the dream. He told the king that the statue represented a succession of earthly kingdoms, with Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon being the head of gold. But ultimately, all human empires, no matter how glorious, would be smashed and replaced by a divine kingdom that would never be destroyed. For a moment, Nebuchadnezzar was humbled. He acknowledged the power of Daniel's God, but the humility was short-lived. The poison of pride was too deep.
Instead of accepting his place as the head of gold, Nebuchadnezzar decided to defy the prophecy. He built a 90-foot-tall statue made entirely of gold and commanded every official in his empire to fall down and worship it. It was an act of supreme hubris. He was attempting to make his kingdom eternal, to make himself a god. When 3 young Hebrew men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused to bow, Nebuchadnezzar was enraged. His pride was challenged, and his fury was absolute. He had them thrown into a furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. But when he looked into the fire, he saw 4 men walking unharmed, and the 4th looked like the son of the gods. He had witnessed a power greater than his own, and yet the lesson still did not sink in. The final warning came in another dream, this time of a massive tree that was chopped down. Again, Daniel interpreted it, warning the king that his pride would lead to his downfall. He would be stripped of his kingdom and his sanity until he acknowledged that the Most High is sovereign over all. For a year, nothing happened. Then, one day, as Nebuchadnezzar was walking on the roof of his royal palace, admiring his creation, his ego reached its zenith. "Is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence, by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" The words had barely left his mouth when a voice spoke from heaven. The judgment had come. The Bible describes a horrifying descent into madness, a rare psychological condition known today as boanthropy, where a person believes they are an ox. He was driven away from people and ate grass like the ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. This was the ultimate tragedy of pride. The most powerful man on earth, who saw himself as a god, was reduced to the level of a beast. His crown was replaced with matted hair, his throne with a muddy field, his scepter with claws. He was stripped of everything, his power, his glory, his reason, his very humanity, and forced to live as a wild animal. For 7 years, the great emperor was a monster, a terrifying spectacle of what happens when human pride declares war on God. Then, at the end of the 7 years, something shifted. In the depths of his madness, Nebuchadnezzar looked up. "I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored." He was healed, humbled, and brought back to his throne, but he was a changed man. His pride was shattered, replaced by a profound reverence for the God who had broken him. Nebuchadnezzar's story is the tragedy of divine humiliation. It is the most dramatic illustration of the ancient proverb, "Pride goes before destruction," a haughty spirit before a fall. He teaches us that the ego, left unchecked, is a self-destructive force. It builds empires of gold only to see them crumble. His life is a terrifying reminder that true power is not found in exalting oneself, but in recognizing a power far greater than our own.
Number 3. Saul, the king consumed by his own shadow. At number 3, we have the tragic story of a man who was given everything he needed to succeed, but was destroyed from within. He was Israel's first king, a man chosen by God and acclaimed by the people, King Saul. Saul's story begins with immense promise. He was described as a choice and handsome man. There was not a more handsome person than he among the children of Israel. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. He was the physical ideal of a king. Anointed by the prophet Samuel, he was filled with the Spirit of God and led Israel to decisive victories against their enemies, like the Ammonites. He was, for a time, a humble and effective leader. He was chosen by God. His tragedy was his insecurity.
The cracks in his character appeared early. Before a crucial battle against the Philistines, he was told to wait for Samuel to arrive to offer the pre-battle sacrifice. But as the troops grew restless and started to desert, Saul panicked. Fearing he would lose control, he took matters into his own hands and performed the sacrifice himself, a role reserved only for the prophet. It was an act of impatience born from a lack of faith. When Samuel arrived, his rebuke was devastating. "You have done a foolish thing. Your kingdom will not endure." Saul's core tragic flaw was a deep-seated insecurity that festered into paranoia and jealousy. He craved the approval of the people more than the approval of God. He was a king who was constantly looking over his shoulder, terrified of being replaced, terrified of anyone who seemed more popular or more successful than him.
And then that person arrived. A young shepherd boy named David. After David famously slew the giant Goliath, the women of Israel danced in the streets, singing a song that would become Saul's personal poison. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. To a secure leader, this would be a moment of pride in his young champion. To the insecure Saul, it was a death knell. The text says, "And Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him. And he said, They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom?" So Saul eyed David from that day forward.
That jealousy became a consuming obsession, a tormenting spirit that drove him to madness. The man who was once a national hero became a tyrant, hunting his most loyal servant. David, who loved Saul and tried to soothe him with music, became the target of his murderous rage. Twice, Saul tried to pin David to the wall with a spear. He sent him on impossible military missions, hoping he would be killed by the Philistines. He marshaled the entire Israelite army, not to fight foreign enemies, but to hunt one innocent man through the wilderness of Judah. His paranoia destroyed his judgment and his relationships. He became estranged from his own son, Jonathan, who loved David as a brother. He ordered the massacre of an entire town of priests for giving David aid. Saul, the chosen king, had become a monster, consumed by the shadow of his own insecurity.
His tragic end was as dark as his reign had become. On the eve of his final battle against the Philistines, a terrified Saul, feeling abandoned by God, sought guidance from a medium, the witch of Endor, an act he himself had outlawed. He asked her to summon the spirit of the dead prophet Samuel. The apparition of Samuel rose and gave him no comfort,
only a prophecy of doom. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor, to David. Tomorrow, you and your sons will be with me. The next day, on Mount Gilboa, the prophecy came true. The Israelite army was routed, and Saul's sons, including the noble Jonathan, were killed. Wounded and facing capture, the first king of Israel fell on his own sword, taking his own life. Saul's life is the tragedy of a leader destroyed by his own inner demons. He had the crown, the army, and the initial blessing of God, but he lacked the one thing a leader cannot survive without: a secure sense of self. His story is a powerful psychological portrait of how insecurity, when left to fester, inevitably turns into jealousy, paranoia, and self-destruction. It teaches us that the most dangerous enemy a leader will ever face is not on the battlefield, but in the mirror.
Number 2. Solomon, the wisest man who played the fool. In the number 2 spot, we find a king whose tragedy is perhaps the most insidious, because it wasn't a sudden, violent fall. It was a slow, luxurious slide into ruin. He was the wisest, richest, and most magnificent king in Israel's history, King Solomon, son of David. Solomon's reign was the zenith of the Israelite kingdom. His story begins with a humble and noble request. When God appeared to him in a dream and offered him anything he wanted, the young Solomon didn't ask for riches or long life. He asked for wisdom to govern his people justly. God was so pleased with this request that he gave him not only unparalleled wisdom, but also wealth and honor beyond any king before or after him. The legends of his wisdom are famous. The story of the 2 mothers and the baby, his 3,000 proverbs, his knowledge of botany and zoology. The world came to hear his wisdom, including the Queen of Sheba, who was left breathless by his intellect and the splendor of his kingdom. He built the first temple in Jerusalem, a breathtaking structure of cedar and gold, the permanent dwelling place for the Ark of the Covenant. Under his rule, Israel enjoyed an unprecedented era of peace and prosperity. He had everything a human could desire. His tragedy was that everything was not enough.
Solomon's tragic flaw was not a single action, but a slow, creeping compromise that eroded his soul over decades. The flaw was rooted in his foreign policy. To secure his kingdom, Solomon entered into political alliances with the surrounding nations, and the seal of these alliances was marriage. The Bible records a staggering number. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. This wasn't merely a personal indulgence, it was a state-sponsored policy of assimilation. And these foreign women did not come alone. They brought their gods with them. At first, Solomon may have just tolerated their worship to keep his wives happy and his treaty secure, but tolerance slowly bled into participation, and participation into promotion. The text of 1 Kings is shockingly clear. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. This was a catastrophic betrayal. The very man who had built the magnificent temple to the one true God was now using his wealth and power to build pagan shrines on the hills overlooking God's holy city. The wisest man in the world was committing spiritual suicide. He knew God's law, which explicitly forbade this, but he allowed his political ambitions and his personal affections to override his covenant. His heart, the scripture says, was turned away. His compromise was a spiritual cancer that metastasized throughout the kingdom. The Golden Age was built on a rotten foundation.
The judgment, when it came, was not a lightning bolt from heaven, but a quiet, devastating prophecy of division. God told Solomon that because of his faithlessness, the kingdom would be torn from his son's hand. For the sake of his father David, God would not do it in Solomon's lifetime, but the fracture was inevitable. The united kingdom, the great legacy of his father that he had built into an empire, would be shattered. After Solomon's death, the prophecy was fulfilled exactly. The 10 northern tribes of Israel rebelled against his son, Rehoboam, and formed their own kingdom. The Golden Age was over. The nation was plunged into centuries of civil war, idolatry, and eventual conquest and exile. The magnificent empire Solomon built crumbled into dust because its builder had a divided heart. Solomon's life is the tragedy of the slow compromise. He didn't fall because of a single dramatic sin, but because of 1,000 small concessions that slowly poisoned his devotion. He teaches us that even the greatest wisdom is useless if the heart is not whole. His story is a haunting warning that the path to ruin is often paved with reasonable, pragmatic, and seemingly harmless compromises. He had the whole world, but in the end, he lost his own soul, and his kingdom along with it.
Number 1. David, the king after God's own heart, broken by his own. And now at number 1, the most powerful, the most beloved, and by far the most tragic king in the entire Bible. His is a tragedy so profound precisely because he was the greatest of them all. He was the giant slayer, the poet warrior, the man who united the 12 tribes into a single mighty nation. He was, in the Bible's own words, a man after God's own heart, King David. David's story is the stuff of legend. He was the shepherd boy chosen from obscurity over his stronger, taller brothers. He defeated a 9-foot champion with a single stone. He was a military genius who never lost a battle. He was a masterful musician and poet whose psalms have become the prayer book for billions. He conquered Jerusalem and made it his capital, established an empire, and received a divine promise that his throne would last forever, culminating in the Messiah. He was the archetypal hero king. His bond with God was intimate and real. His triumphs were legendary. And that is what makes his fall so devastating. His tragedy was born from a single moment of unchecked passion. The story is infamous, recounted in 2 Samuel. It was springtime, the time when kings go off to war. But David, now at the peak of his power, stayed behind in Jerusalem. One evening, from the roof of his palace, he saw a beautiful woman bathing. Her name was Bathsheba, and in that moment, the hero king became a predator. He sent for her. He knew she was the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of his most loyal and elite soldiers, a man who was at that very moment on the front lines fighting David's war. But David's desire overrode his honor. He slept with her. Weeks later, the message came. Bathsheba was pregnant. Panic set in. David initiated a desperate, cruel cover-up. He recalled Uriah from the battlefield, hoping he would sleep with his wife, thus hiding the child's true parentage. But Uriah's honor was a stinging rebuke to David's own dishonor. His plan foiled. David descended into the ultimate evil. He wrote a letter to his general Joab and sent it back with Uriah himself. The loyal soldier was carrying his own death warrant. Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die. And so it was done. Uriah the Hittite, a man of honor and loyalty, was murdered by the king he served. After a suitable period of mourning, David brought Bathsheba into his palace and made her his wife. The cover-up was complete. The sin was hidden from the world. David, the king after God's own heart, was now an adulterer and a murderer. But nothing is hidden from God. He sent the prophet Nathan to confront the king. Nathan told David a simple story about a rich man who stole a poor man's one beloved lamb to feed a guest. David, his sense of justice still intact, was enraged by the story and declared that the rich man deserved to die. And then Nathan delivered the 4 most devastating words in the Old Testament. He pointed his finger at the king and said, "You are the man." In that moment, David's world collapsed. His sin was exposed, and he was utterly broken. He repented with a grief so profound it was immortalized in Psalm 51. But forgiveness does not always erase consequences. Nathan delivered God's verdict. The child conceived in adultery would die, and the sword would never depart from David's own house.
This was the true, agonizing tragedy of David. His sin unleashed a torrent of suffering on the people he loved most. His family became a cesspool of lust, betrayal, and violence. His daughter Tamar was raped by his eldest son, Amnon. David, compromised by his own past, did nothing. 2 years later, Tamar's brother, Absalom, murdered Amnon in cold blood. Absalom then led a rebellion that captured the hearts of the people and forced David, the great king, to flee his own capital as a fugitive. The civil war culminated in a battle where Absalom was killed against David's express orders. The news of his rebellious son's death did not bring David relief. It brought him the greatest grief of his life. "Oh, my son Absalom! My son Absalom! If only I had died instead of you! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son!" David's story is the ultimate tragedy of moral failure. He shows us that a single, selfish act, no matter how secret, can have catastrophic, generational consequences. He is a terrifying example of how even the most righteous and beloved leader can be brought to ruin by unchecked passion. His life is a testament that the consequences of sin are not just vertical, between us and God, but horizontal, ripping through the fabric of our families and communities with devastating force. He was the man after God's own heart, but the darkness in that heart nearly destroyed everything he loved.
Ahab, Nebuchadnezzar, Saul, Solomon, David. 5 kings, 5 crowns of sorrow. Their stories, separated by centuries, echo a single, timeless truth. Power does not corrupt, it reveals. The flaws that destroyed these men, weakness, pride, insecurity, compromise, lust, were not created by the crown, they were merely amplified by it. Their lives are a warning that echoes through the corridors of history, speaking to every CEO, every politician, every parent, every person in a position of influence. Ahab warns us that leadership without conviction is an empty shell, easily filled by malevolent forces. Nebuchadnezzar warns us that ego is a form of madness, turning builders of empires into beasts of the field. Saul warns us that insecurity is a poison that turns allies into enemies and leaders into tyrants.
Solomon warns us that the road to ruin is paved with small, pragmatic compromises that slowly steal the heart. And David, the greatest and most tragic of all, warns us that a lifetime of devotion can be fractured by a moment of unguarded passion, unleashing a pain that will haunt us to the grave. These are not just ancient stories. They are mirrors. In their tragic falls, we see the potential for our own. They remind us that the most important kingdom to rule is the one within our own soul. And that is a battle that is won or lost not in grand armies or magnificent palaces, but in the quiet, secret choices we make every single day.